The sun was sinking behind the hills when Wade Collins rode into the quiet little town. The winter wind carried dust and cold with it, making even strong men pull their coats tighter. Wade had been traveling for many weeks with a cattle drive, moving herds across dry land, open plains, and narrow passes. His horse was tired, and so was he. All he wanted was warm food, a safe place to sleep, and a quiet night without trouble. But as he rode through the main street, he noticed something that made him slow down. A small cabin, standing alone near a patch of bare trees, had a thin trail of smoke rising from the chimney. He knew that cabin. Everybody in town did. It belonged to Emma Hale, the widow who lived alone since her husband passed away nearly 2 years ago. Wade had seen her once or twice, mostly from a distance. She was a quiet woman with gentle eyes and a calm way of speaking. People respected her, but they kept a respectful distance too. She spent her days tending chickens, chopping wood, sewing clothes for nearby families, and trying to manage the land her husband left behind. She rarely came into town unless she absolutely needed supplies. Tonight, her chimney smoke looked faint, almost too faint for such cold weather. Wade frowned. A cold cabin meant not enough wood. Not enough wood meant the night would be harsh on anyone living inside. He guided his horse toward the edge of town where the cabin stood. He didn't know if he should stop, but something inside him said he should at least check if everything was all right. The freezing air bit at his face as he reached the small porch. He pulled a small sack of dry firewood from his saddle and walked to her door. He knocked gently. A moment later, the door opened just a crack. Emma stood there, wrapped in a simple shawl, her cheeks slightly pale from the cold. Her dark hair was tied back loosely, and her eyes widened with surprise when she saw him. "Mr. Collins?" she said softly. "You're back from the cattle drive." Wade nodded. "Yes, ma'am. Just got in. I noticed your chimney smoke was thin, so I brought you some wood. Thought you might need it on a night like this." Emma looked at the sack in his hand. For a moment she didn't speak. Then she opened the door wider. "That's very kind of you," she said. "Please come in. It's freezing outside." Wade stepped inside. The cabin was small, but tidy. A simple table stood near the window, and a small stove crackled quietly in the corner. A few handmade blankets hung on the chairs, and shelves filled with jars of dried vegetables lined the wall. Though warm, the room still carried a faint chill. "You didn't have enough wood?" Wade asked gently. Emma shook her head. "Not as much as I hoped. The last storm took down one of the big branches on the oak tree, and I couldn't cut enough pieces before the cold returned." Wade set the sack by the stove and added a few logs to strengthen the fire. The flame grew brighter, warming the room almost instantly. Emma watched him with grateful eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. "You're welcome," Wade replied, brushing frost off his coat. "Didn't feel right riding past without checking on you." There was a silence, comfortable but filled with unspoken understanding. Emma poured him a cup of warm tea and placed it in his hands. Wade wrapped his fingers around the cup, letting the warmth settle into his bones. "You must be tired from the long trip," she said. Wade nodded. "It's been a long ride. Nights on the trail get real cold. But your cabin, it feels peaceful." Emma offered a small smile. "It's quiet, at least." A soft wind rattled the window. The fire crackled again. For a long moment, they sat with only the sound of the stove filling the room. Wade felt something inside him loosen something that had been tight for years. He had traveled from ranch to ranch, never staying long enough to form real connections. But here, in this small cabin, sitting across from a quiet widow, he felt something warm before he could stop himself. The word slipped out of his mouth, soft, honest, and unexpected even to him. "I'd trade 10 herds for just one night of your company." Emma froze. Her eyes widened, and she seemed too surprised to speak. Wade realized immediately how his words sounded and shook his head quickly. "I didn't mean anything wrong," he said, gentle but firm. "I only meant a quiet night, talking, sitting by the fire, not being alone." He paused, carefully choosing his simple words. "Company. Just that." Emma lowered her gaze, understanding his meaning now. She felt a small pinch in her chest, not fear, but something else. Something warm. Something she hadn't felt in a long time. Companionship. When her husband died, she had shut her heart tightly, afraid to feel again. She had learned to live with silence, cold nights, and lonely mornings. She never imagined anyone would speak to her with such honest longing. "I appreciate your words," she murmured, her voice steady but soft. "More than you know." Wade hesitated. He didn't want her to think he expected anything. So he stood up, placed his empty cup on the table, and tipped his hat politely. "I better let you rest," he said. Didn't mean to cause any worry. Emma followed him to the door. The cold air rushed in when he opened it. He stepped outside, but before he walked down the porch steps, Emma spoke again. "Wade." He turned. "You didn't cause any worry. Your company was nice." Something in his eyes softened. He nodded once, then mounted his horse. As he rode away, the moonlight reflected on the snow, lighting his path. Emma stood at the doorway longer than she planned, watching his figure become smaller and smaller until it disappeared behind the snowy ridge. When she finally closed the door, she pressed her hand over her heart. The cabin felt warmer now, not just from the fire, but from the quiet conversation that had filled the room for the first time in a long while. She felt the weight of loneliness lift just a little. The next day, Emma tried to carry on with her work, but her thoughts kept drifting back to Wade. She remembered the sincerity in his voice, the way he placed the wood beside her stove without expecting anything, the tired but kind look in his eyes. She found herself standing at the window more often than usual, glancing at the trail leading to town. Each time she looked, her heart beat faster for a moment only, to settle again when the path remained empty. She scolded herself quietly. "Stop waiting," she whispered. "He probably has his own work to do." Still, she couldn't help it. Later that afternoon, she carried a basket of laundry to the small stream behind her cabin. The water was icy, and she winced as she dipped the clothes in. The cold bit at her skin until her fingers turned numb. She worked slowly, fighting the biting wind. Halfway through, she felt the ground tremble slightly. "Who?" She turned, and there he was. Wade Collins rode up the trail on his brown gelding, his coat dusted with frost again. He dismounted quietly, tying his horse to a nearby tree. "You're out here alone?" he asked gently. "Water's freezing today." "I'm used to it," Emma said softly, brushing her wet hands against her skirt. He frowned. "Your hands are shaking." She looked away. "It's nothing." Wade stepped closer and offered her a dry cloth from his saddlebag. "Use this. Let me help." Emma hesitated, but finally handed him a shirt to rinse. Wade worked beside her without complaint, without making her feel helpless or weak. He moved slowly, careful not to splash cold water on her. She watched him for a moment, surprised at how naturally he fit into the small tasks she struggled with daily. When they finished, Wade carried the basket for her back to the cabin. He hung the clothes beside the stove to dry, then turned to her. "You don't have to do everything alone," he said quietly. "Sometimes a person needs help, and that's all right." Emma swallowed a lump in her throat. "Thank you," she whispered. Wade nodded and took a step back, tipping his hat. "I'll stop by again soon." "If that's all right?" Emma felt her heart flutter lightly. "Yes, that's all right." Wade smiled, just a small, gentle one, before stepping outside. Emma watched him leave again, feeling something new bloom inside her chest. Something warm. Something hopeful. She wasn't ready to call it anything yet, but she was ready to stop pretending. She didn't need anyone, and that feeling alone was the beginning of a change she had never expected. The winter sun was weak and pale when Emma Hale stepped outside her cabin. Snow covered the ground like a thick blanket, soft and silent. She breathed out slowly, watching her breath turn into a small cloud before fading away. Winter was always hard for her, but this year felt heavier. The storm from last night had damaged the chicken coop, and the roof sagged under the weight of snow. Emma wrapped her shawl closer around her shoulders and picked up a small shovel. Her hands trembled from cold and tiredness, but she kept working. She had no one else to depend on. She had learned to do everything alone since her husband passed away 2 years earlier. People in town respected her, but they also assumed she was strong enough to manage. No one knew how hard the quiet nights felt. No one knew how often she sat near the fire, staring at the empty chair that used to hold her husband. She tried to lift a wooden beam that had fallen off the roof of the coop. It was heavy, but she pushed with all her strength. The snow cracked under her feet, and she nearly lost her balance. Her boots slipped a little, and she had to quickly step back to avoid falling. Just then, she heard hooves crunching in the snow. Emma turned. Wade Collins was riding up the narrow trail leading to her cabin. His horse, a strong brown gelding, moved calmly despite the cold wind. Wade's coat was dusted with snow, and he sat tall in his saddle, scanning the property with concern. He dismounted before the horse even stopped completely. "Morning, ma'am," he said gently, brushing frost from his gloves. "Heard the storm made trouble this way?" Emma stood still, embarrassed that he had arrived right when she was struggling. "I'm all right," she replied quietly. "Just trying to fix the coop." Wade glanced at the beam on the ground. "That's a two-man job," he said simply. Emma didn't know how to respond. She wanted to say she could handle it. The truth was she couldn't. Wade walked past her and easily lifted the heavy beam with both hands. He placed it back into position with hardly any effort. Emma watched silently, surprised at how quickly he worked. "You didn't have to come," she said finally. "I don't want to trouble anyone." Wade looked at her with calm brown eyes. "Helping ain't trouble," he said it in such a steady voice that it melted some of the tension in her chest. Wade wasn't the kind of man who spoke too much. He wasn't loud or boastful like some cowboys in town. He did things quietly, kindly, without asking for anything. For the next hour, fixed the coop roof, cleared snow from her porch, and checked the frozen water barrel behind her cabin. Emma tried to help, but Wade insisted she'd stay warm inside when her hands started shaking. When he was done, he knocked on her door softly. She opened it and saw him standing there with snowflakes in his hair, boots covered in frost. "It's fixed," he said. "Your hens should be safe now." Emma felt a wave of relief. "Thank you," she said. "Would you like some warm tea before you go?" Wade hesitated, as if he didn't want to overstep, then nodded politely. "If it's no trouble." Inside, the cabin smelled of fresh bread and pine wood. The fire popped gently in the stove. Wade removed his gloves and sat on the chair nearest the warmth. Emma poured tea into 2 cups and placed one in front of him. He wrapped his hands around it, letting the heat sink into his fingers. They sat in comfortable silence for a few moments. "You've been working too hard?" Wade finally said. "Storms like these can take down even a strong ranch." Emma lowered her eyes. "I'm trying, but some days feel heavier than others." Wade nodded slowly, understanding without needing to ask questions. After finishing his tea, he stood up quietly. "If you need anything at all, you can send word to the Collins Ranch. I'm staying put for a while." Emma nodded, though she knew she would never ask. She watched him leave through the frosted window. His horse disappeared behind the ridge, and the quiet returned. Over the next few days, life didn't get easier. Food storage ran low. The last storm had damaged the fence on the east side of her land, letting some animals wander off. She found tracks but could not locate 2 of her goats. The steps she followed in the snow became lost near the creek. She spent her evenings sewing torn clothes and trying to stretch her. The days were short. The nights were long and cold. A small part of her wondered if Wade would return. But she didn't allow herself to depend on the thought. One morning, the storekeeper in town, Mr. Howell, noticed how pale she looked when she came in to buy flour. "You all right, Emma?" he asked kindly. "You look worn." "Just tired," she replied, forcing a small smile. Mr. Howell wanted to ask more, but she quickly paid and left. She didn't want to become a topic of gossip. She valued her privacy. More than anything, but someone else heard about her visit. Wade had come into the store shortly after she left. He saw the worry on Mr. Howell's face and asked what happened. The storekeeper explained that Emma seemed exhausted, maybe not eating enough, maybe carrying more burden than she admitted. That was all Wade needed to hear. He bought extra supplies wood, rope, flour, and a few other things, and loaded them on his horse. Without waiting for the weather to clear, he rode toward her cabin. When he arrived, he saw her struggling again, this time trying to repair the fence alone. She was using a hammer with numb fingers that kept slipping. She didn't hear him approach until he was already beside her. "You're out here in this cold?" Wade asked quietly. Emma flinched, startled. "Wade, I didn't hear you coming." He noticed the redness around her eyes, the tiredness in her shoulders, the way her breath trembled each time she exhaled. "You should be inside resting," he said gently. "I'll fix the fence." Kenny shook his head. "Let me." There was no pride in his voice, no judgment, just steady concern. Emma stepped back and watched as he replaced broken posts, tightened wires, and set the fence upright again. He moved with practiced skill as though he had repaired fences his whole life. When he finished, she invited him indoors again. This time, she felt less shy. She realized she trusted him more than she trusted anyone else. Inside the cabin, they sat by the fire. Emma cooked a simple meal stew made from potatoes, beans, and a bit of dried meat. Wade didn't complain or act disappointed. He ate slowly, savoring every bite. "You cook better than most ranches I've stayed at," he said with a faint smile. Emma laughed softly. "That's kind of you to say." After the meal, Wade looked at her with a seriousness that made her heart beat faster. "I meant what I said the other night," he began, "about wanting company. But I didn't mean anything wrong. I just meant it gets lonely out there. And when I talked with you, it felt peaceful, like being home." Emma's eyes softened. She placed her hands on her lap, thinking of her late husband, of all the silent evenings she had endured since his passing. "I haven't spoken honestly with anyone for a long time," she said quietly. "I thought if I opened my heart again, I might lose someone again." Wade nodded slowly. "I understand loss better than most. I ain't asking for anything you're not ready to give. I only want to be a friend. Someone you can call when the snow is too heavy or the nights get too long." Emma looked at him. His coat was torn in some places, his boots worn, his hands rough from years of ranch work. But his eyes were gentle, filled with honesty and warmth. "Thank you," she whispered. He stayed a little longer, telling her stories of the trail of long nights by fires, of storms he fought through, of cowboys who became like family. Emma listened with quiet interest. His words made her forget the heaviness of the season for a while. When it was time for him to leave, he stood at the door and looked back at her. "If the weather gets bad again, light a lantern in the window," he said. "I'll see it from the ridge." Emma nodded, touched by the simple offer as Wade rode away that night. She watched the small figure move through the snow until he vanished behind the trees. For the first time in many months, she felt safe. Not because she was strong, because someone cared enough to stand with her. The winter still pressed hard on her land, but her heart felt a little warmer, a little lighter. The loneliness that once filled every corner of her cabin now seemed to shrink, replaced by the quiet comfort of a cowboy who showed up without being asked. The wind whistled through the bare branches as the evening sky slowly darkened into shades of blue and deep gray. Emma Hale stood near her window, watching the horizon with a worried heart. The weather had been mild that morning, but by afternoon the clouds had gathered thick and heavy. Snowflakes had started falling just before sunset, slow at first, then faster. Spinning wildly in the rising wind, she stepped outside to latch the barn door properly and check the coop one last time before the storm worsened. The air was sharp and biting. She wrapped her shawl around her shoulders tightly, but the cold pushed through the wool like tiny needles. As Emma walked back toward the cabin, she paused. Far in the distance, a faint figure moved along the ridge, almost blending into the swirling snow. Her heart skipped. The figure became clearer as it approached, all steady, moving with purpose. It was Wade Collins. His horse trudged through the snow carefully, steam rising from its breath. Wade pulled his coat tighter, but even from afar, Emma could tell he was freezing. She hurried inside and lit an extra lantern, then opened the door before he reached the porch. Wade stopped his horse and slid down stiffly. Snow covered his hat and shoulders. His cheeks were red from the cold, and his breath came out in white puffs. "You're out in this storm?" Emma asked, her voice filled with worry. Wade shook snow from his coat. "Saw the clouds rolling in quick. Thought I'd better check on you." Emma stepped aside, urging him in. "Come inside now. You're nearly frozen." He hesitated only a moment before walking into the warm cabin. Emma closed the door behind him, locking out the icy wind. Wade stood near the stove, rubbing his hands together as the heat seeped into his fingers. "Storm hit faster than I expected," he said quietly. "I'm glad you made it before it got worse." Emma replied. She removed his wet gloves and set them near the stove to dry. Then she poured him a cup of warm broth, made from vegetables she had cooked earlier. Wade accepted it gratefully and sat in the same chair he had sat in before, close to the fire. Not too close. Emma watched him for a moment. Something about his presence eased her, even though the storm outside was becoming dangerous. The wind howled fiercely, shaking the walls and rattling the windows. Snow piled up quickly, cutting off any view of the distant trail. "You won't be able to ride back tonight," Emma said softly. Wade nodded. "I figured that when the wind picked up—" "I didn't mean to trouble you." "It's no trouble," she said, more honestly than she expected. "I'd rather you stay warm and safe than risk the trail." For a moment, they both listened to the storm pounding against the cabin. Then Emma added another log to the fire. The flames rose, throwing warm light across the room and chasing shadows away. Wade looked around the small cabin carefully, as if seeing it differently tonight. "Your home feels peaceful," he said. Emma smiled faintly. "It feels less lonely now." He lowered his eyes at that, touched by her words. As the storm grew louder, Emma prepared a simple meal. She placed a pot over the stove, stirring slowly. Wade offered to help, but she insisted he rest. His face looked tired, more tired than she had ever seen. The trail and winter winds had stolen energy from him. But his steady nature never let it show. When the meal was ready, warm stew and slices of fresh bread, they sat at the table, eating quietly. The flames cast soft shadows across the walls. Outside, the world was wild, cold, and unforgiving. But inside the cabin was a bubble of warmth and calm. "Tell me about your travels," Emma said gently. "Where do cowboys like you go each season?" Wade leaned back slightly, thinking. "Everywhere," he began. "Montana, in the summer sometimes. Texas, when the cold gets too sharp. Miles and miles of open land. Sometimes you go weeks without seeing anything but cattle, sky, and dirt." Emma listened carefully, imagining the life he described. A life of constant movement. A life of uncertainty. A life with no real place to call home. "Don't you get tired of traveling so much?" she asked. Wade looked into the fire for a moment. "I do, more than I used to. When I was young, the trail felt like freedom. But now, sometimes it just feels like running from the quiet." Emma's breath caught at that. "Running from the quiet?" Wade nodded slowly. "Quiet makes a person think too much. About things they can't change. People they lost. Places they should have stayed longer." Emma looked down at her hands. She knew that kind of quiet wealth, a kind that sat with you even when you tried to ignore it. Maybe quiet isn't so bad. Sometimes it lets you heal. Wade let out a slow breath. "Maybe you're right." They talked for a long time about simple things, about old memories, about dreams neither of them had spoken aloud before. Emma found herself laughing gently at stories Wade shared about mischievous cowhands who played harmless pranks during long rides. Wade smiled when she told him about the stubborn goat she used to have that once jumped through a window. The storm outside seemed to fade each time. Their voices filled the room. Later, when the wind became too strong, Emma lit another lantern and placed it on the windowsill. The warm glow pushed back the darkness outside. Wade stood beside her, watching the snow swirl wildly. "If that lantern wasn't lit," he said softly, "I might have missed the cabin completely." Emma looked at him. "Maybe I lit it because I hoped you'd come." Wade blinked, surprised by her honesty. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Wade nodded once, quietly touched. "I'm glad I came too," he whispered. They moved back to the fire. Emma placed her shawl around her shoulders and settled into the rocking chair. Wade took his usual seat near the stove. The warmth wrapped around them like a blanket, protecting them from the cold world outside. "What did you mean the other night?" Emma asked suddenly. "When you said you'd trade 10 herds for one night of my company?" Wade took a deep breath. His voice was low, steady, without any hesitation. "I meant that good company is rare. Someone who listens. Someone who's kind. Someone who makes silence feel gentle instead of heavy." He paused. "I'd give up a lot just to spend a calm, honest evening with someone like that." Emma felt her heart warm. "Wade, you didn't have to trade anything." He looked at her with soft eyes. "I know." They sat in silence, but it wasn't the hollow silence of lonely hearts. It was peaceful, warm, full of unspoken understanding. Hours passed. The storm outside raged on, but inside the fire crackled steadily. Emma noticed Wade's eyes growing heavy. His shoulders slouched slightly, showing his exhaustion. "You can rest," she said gently. "Tonight, you stay here." Wade straightened. "I don't want to impose." "It's not imposing," Emma said firmly. "It's safe, and it's warm. That's all." Wade hesitated, then nodded gratefully. Emma set blankets on the smaller bed near the stove, the one she used to use when her husband fell sick long ago. She placed extra pillows and made sure the room was warm enough. Wade thanked her, and she nodded quietly, stepping back. But instead of going to her own room, Emma sat by the fire again. She wasn't tired yet. Something about tonight felt important. She wanted to hold on to it. Wade lay down for a moment, but after a few minutes he sat up again, unable to sleep while Emma was still awake. "You all right?" he asked softly. Emma nodded. "Yes. I'm just thinking." Wade came to sit beside her, respecting her space, but close enough to offer quiet support. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. Emma looked at the flames slowly dancing in the stove. "I'm thinking that I haven't felt this kind of peace in a long time. Not since before my husband passed." Wade stayed silent, letting her speak at her own pace. "I thought I was meant to be alone after that," she continued. "I thought letting anyone close would feel like betraying him. But you don't take his place. You just bring warmth back into the room." Wade swallowed, his eyes soft with understanding. "I don't want to replace anything or anyone," he said quietly. "I just want to stand where I'm needed, even if it's just for friendship, even if it's just to fix a fence or share a warm drink." Emma looked at him, her eyes shining in the firelight. "You bring more than that," she said. They didn't need to say more. The snowstorm howled outside. The cabin felt like the safest place in the world. By midnight, the storm began to weaken. The wind softened. The snow fell slower. The world outside was still white but calmer. Wade finally drifted to sleep beneath the blankets. Emma watched him for a moment. He looked peaceful, much more than he had looked when he first stepped into her cabin earlier that evening. She whispered softly, "You don't have to wander every road alone anymore." Emma walked to her own room. But before closing the door, she looked back once more. The lantern on the window still glowed gently. Wade's horse was safe in the barn. The fire was strong. She felt a quiet fullness in her chest. Something new. Something hopeful. For months she had lived alone with silence. But tonight, the silence felt warm, not empty. It felt like a beginning. Not a promise, not a pledge. Just the first real moment of peace she had shared with someone since her husband's passing. And sometimes, that was enough to start healing.